My name is Vanessa Viola. My pronouns are she, her. I'm an architecture librarian, and my colleague is Elijah Williams, educator and digital technology specialist from the School of Architecture and Design. So today we are working with narrating the built environment for design research. We're going to go through some tools and examples for integrating open data, including NYC Open Data, and introducing it to undergraduates and graduate classes, especially those in architecture and design education.
Yeah, so we structure this much like all the presentations that we give to undergraduate students or professors or whatnot. We're first introduced to sort of why we're here, and we'll study actually a typical design research student project called the Slant, is the student's name of the project, as a case study. We'll walk through the activity that these students and similar students went through in order to figure out what data is first before we can talk about what open data is, what it means to look at data sets that are about the built environment, which is the category that this presentation is going to focus on, um, and figure out what those takeaways are. I actually saw that Evan Chia is here, and we'll actually be showcasing some of his students' models after they went through our workshop. And then the conclusion is going to be building, or the third part is going to be building your own workshop activity. And so we, of course, come from design education and specifically like undergraduate architecture schools, but we think, and the reason why we're here, I think, is building activities and workshops around open data can be really easy and really fun. And so we actually provide a pretty clear, transparent framework that you can use to take to whether or not it's your coworkers or peers or students or if you're invited to talk about open data in some way, it can be great to not have to just talk for an hour, but instead have people explore the data sets and do all that sort of stuff. So that'll be the structure for today's stuff.
So talking a little bit about the usability, we really wanted to share a little bit more about why we do what we do. Um, I think right off the bat, in my experience as a librarian, kind of floating in and out of design classes, and talking with students, that sometimes there is a disconnect between a static graph or map that was integrated into a student's design proposal and their understanding of the data that was within it and how they interpreted the graph. So when I had the opportunity to become an open data ambassador, I saw that this was a way that I could bring data literacy into the classroom with a nice, concise, clear platform that was very relevant to the New York Institute of Technology students. We have it, for context, we have a campus here on Long Island, and we have a campus in New York City. And so oftentimes our sites for building designs occur right in our own backyard.
Yeah, and so we were really excited when we started to look for data sets, as I'm sure everyone who's here has, that a lot of the work has already been done to organize that, and that we could really introduce it to students and invite them to have their own critical lens. So I think that'll kind of be the theme today. Is we know we'll show you and talk through how to access some resources, obviously, but also that within educational or presentation spaces, you get to also be critical and challenge assumptions or first guesses that data viewers might make. And so one of the ways that we do that is by having engaging activities that don't, that are conversations. So
Just to give you a little more formal concept, like I mentioned, I was trained as an open data ambassador, and we realized within our general education requirement here at New York Tech, there's been an introduction of a data discovery 101 course. Freshmen in their first year take this class and they look at things like understanding data location, comprehending data, and using data to make their own arguments, pro con, much like you would conduct a literature review or scholarly research. Now we've added a layer of understanding data and harnessing data. So we wanted to, I wanted to elevate and pinpoint skills around locating spatial information and finding this globally, recognizing that there are persistent themes, formats, and access and policy And so that when students go out into the world and are starting to do their own research, they can use this, platform to like clearly navigate. They've been exposed to the fundamentals. All right. Things like, finding the relevant data, knowing how to filter it concisely and in a timely manner, and realizing that it meets their information needs. And just to give you an example, this is a slide that I used in earlier presentations, where oftentimes the data is developed both globally to locally, where it's all the way from the United Nations to municipalities like Open Data NYC, to uh, uh, prospective organizations like Food Research and Action Center, Feeding America. Then, just like the open data laws passed in 2012, increasingly municipalities across the United States have their own GIS platform. They have their own data centers to make that data consistently available. So our feeling is that the students they recognize this in our workshop, and then they can persistently recognize this, whether they're in Arkansas or if they're in Paris, if they're designing for Milan, they can quickly comprise their community research.
Yeah, and so a little bit of background, I think design education is a wider category. It covers a lot of like professional, semi-professional, collegiate, non-collegiate fields. And so I myself am a design educator within the architectural subcategory, which means I teach in a 5-year accredited Bachelor's of Architecture program, which means the students are held to a high and complex standard that they will graduate with an understanding of not only how things like buildings are built, but also their interrelationship and play with the other buildings in the area and the people that will one day occupy their spaces, and the wider, I think, increasingly the wider demographic and historical perspectives in which the land and buildings exist. I used the term built environment earlier, which is a really blanket term that's really helpful, that just describes sort of things that aren't people. You can even describe nature as the built environment in a funny way, just things that are happening. And people who study architecture are sort of in study of the built environment. So the task, of course, as are most tasks, is basic in some ways. It's to introduce undergraduate students, people fresh out of high school or returning to college, to this idea of design education. And I think the reason why there's this crossover between myself and Vanessa is what is the role of these university classes in improving or challenging data literacy? And so university professors and whatnot, they don't necessarily have the opportunity to teach critical reading of data sets or something like that. And so that's where me and Vanessa have come in the past, is to introduce data sets that are accessible and introduce language and systems to talk about those pieces. So that's sort of what we're talking about and why we're here. Universities as workplaces or guest presentations or whatnot are really interesting spaces. I think I have these two sort of odd takeaways that are one of the roles that open data and data overall plays in the lens through which I practice architectural education, I guess, is something like the economics of the built environment, which is a really soft, literature heavy idea, right? How much does it cost to build a building? Who are the developers involved? Is it good? Is it bad? Like all of these pieces, there's more written about it than one can read in a lifetime, but it's really a powerful way to think about the world around us, is as it's functioning as an economy, which data sets can make far more legible than I can sort of express that like something like housing is a very complex supply and demand issue funded by the government, right? Or I could say, look at rising house prices over time, and we could engage with it in that way. So there's a lot of different ways in which a university environment is a rare moment in which students, i.e. future professionals, i.e. decision makers in our world, are able to you're able to ask them these questions and they're able to think about their responses. And then, yeah, these are factors that influence their future career. That's not the only reason that college exists, but increasingly that's a major factor, right? What are you going to do after college? And so introducing students to the wider complexities, it's like much like in our introduction, right? Their data sets are here to explain how New York works in a lot of ways. And I think we take that same idea that we're here to explain how the built environment works for better or for worse. And it's our role as educators to tell its full story. And we absolutely love using open data to do that. So
So just, for a broader understanding of, what we're providing for the students here is what is design research. In some cases, this is really their first place where they're doing research from the ground up, from the most basic data. They're gathering original data. In this case, they're learning how to represent it, and then they're analyzing what they found. So these research methods, informing their own projects, and providing an argument for their own projects, that's the essential skill here.
yeah, and importantly, and I'm about to go through this, but importantly, architectural education and design education does not follow, say, the scientific method, or a say corporate review policy, right? Where we sort of the students present to us in a very informal way, where they're sharing what they've learned and their ideas about the problems at hand. And so, Vanessa, if you don't mind going back to that last slide, I think this our wider argument here is that activities and engaging with something like open data, these first two steps are really key. Gathering original data and representing it in a way that's backing up and talking about the story that the student's talking about is the majority of the work here. And the data analysis is far more complex and nuanced than someone in a one semester college class might really be able to engage with. And so this wider shift is actually, we often say, we're trying to move away from students presenting screenshots of infographics and instead towards looking at data problems and presenting their own data sets. So this is an example. I won't go through the whole thing, but this is an example of what a 16-week course syllabus in a design education class would look like. You're welcome to, screenshot or take a photo or something, but it's really fast. Every week is a big, wide, scary concept, in which the students aren't really given a chance to, say, sit down and assemble a data pile or learn a new method of analysis. And instead, they have to find an issue that they're interested in investigating. So if you go, we'll keep moving. In this project, this is the slant case study we talked about earlier. We took the Jamaica train station as a case study for the semester. This is a really awesome project to talk about New York, awesome area to talk about NYC data and open data overall, because it's a bus hub, a Long Island Railroad hub, a subway hub, a commerce hub. There's new housing. It has everything in 3 square blocks. And so I wrote a syllabus for the students to investigate. That's what the 16 weeks we were just looking at. And we identified a site on the next slide here that the students are asked to propose design interventions. And so these are buildings, public spaces, parks, pavilions, all different sorts of things that add to the current built environment. And that's sort of the architecture of it all. And when we're approaching these design education problems, this is sort of the rough format that we'll give. Here's the problem. Here's the site. Let's start working at it. Let's start figuring out what could and couldn't happen. And so in a very and on the next one, we go into sort of the very design school version of it, which is we take some street block lot sizes given to us by New York City data, of course, and we begin to excavate, which in this case is the subway tube, the tunnels that run beneath the site of the site. And then as we step through the next couple of slides, we start to build up the environment around us, which includes existing buildings, proposed buildings, old buildings, new buildings, right? All of the things that happen around. And you'll see in the center here, this is the early iteration of a student's design idea. So we see it says extension and existing corridor, right? So the students are starting to imagine what could happen in and around this site, given that there are current objects here that need to be responded to. And so on the next one, we start to implement why, obviously this stuff's happening physically, it's also happening digitally. And so we can use all different sorts of climate data. We didn't mention too much in this presentation, but we also work in on a research project called Same Lab, where we develop large scale data sets for working on building simulation. And so in this case, we're studying global irradiation across, say, a student's form. And on the next one, we start to map out the sun path throughout the entire project. So these students' projects, one of the things that they were really interested in on the site that we were investigating is population density and movement density. And so this is an example output of this kind of system. They've mapped through their own observation and through programming where and why different movement hotspots are happening on the site. And they include not only their observations, but they also include their proposed. So this is this design education idea layered on top with a very simple data approach. So as we go forward, we'll see how it can start to scale more and more. But in this case, so a great question in the chat, where does the movement data come from? So we actually, in this case, we create our own, right? So we go out, spend hours and hours monitoring and tracking the students go out and track this data on the site. And it's easy to find, and it's really interesting that this kind of thing can now be done, of course, with all different sorts of sensors. But in this case, what we try to do is come up with a design idea that's based upon these movement patterns. And so what the students start to get to as you scoot forward, is here's a multi-level connection system at one of these congestion hotspots on their last map, where the students are able to use permeable facades and ADA accessible transportation systems to shorten the travel distance between the subway and the Long Island Railroad. And so it's a little fast, it's a little all over the place, but this idea of what this data set, what this activity building that we're doing is for, we really want to go over somewhat in depth, like what a undergraduate design student is working on and how we integrate open data into their activity. As an overview, we really spend most of our time in these first four, studying the world around us, integrating data practices, proposing alternatives and changing mediums, models, drawings, renderings, XYZ thing. And then as we're introducing in the activity, we can start to put data flows, synthesis, and then ultimately we have some great examples of visual output here as well.
So in part of building the context for historical data design research, we wanted to bring to students' attention W.E.B. Du Bois's work with visionary infographics in the early late 19th century, early 20th century, where he and a cohort of sociology students started to build these visual infographics on original data they felt it was really resonated very important. So things like roles within a household, how it broke down by gender, statistical charts, some of which they started to gather, but then realized that populations weren't represented properly. So this book has recently become open access. And so we wanted to introduce the students to this format, that it was available, and realize that the long history of collecting and visualizing data and how it's just so important.
And we love this data set and these set of maps as a starting point for what we're working on, because it offers not just a dependency on the data that's currently being collected, but an argument that future systems will collect more in-depth data, right? And so that becomes really, really important as the problems get more and more complex. And so you can imagine the role that ignoring something like this data would play in something like redlining, right? You can imagine that the city could say they don't know XYZ thing, and yet someone could go out with a team of 5 people and pretty easily argue the opposite. And so that's kind of the role that, as we try to introduce the complexity of working with data, that's one of the pieces that we really, really like about this, that it predates. We're really interested in what these are saying now, but maybe 50 or 60 years ago, this would have been very sort of like, I don't know. Is it scientific enough? Is it engaged enough? And we like it because it's a raw data problem. You can't argue with the raw data in that way.
So oops, sorry, everyone. We brought you to part 2. I'm going to share with you, this is a very sensitive hot screen here. This is a Miro board that we use to conduct our exercise with the class. And so now put yourself in I'm going to share this in the chat as well. Put yourself in the student's shoes now and imagine that you are a participant in our workshop. And so we bring you through essentially a portion of part 1. This Miro board serves as a template, so you can see some examples of how we walked everyone through the platform, and we can talk a little bit about the sequencing that we use to bring the students through the data sources and start to recognize the topics that they're broken down with and why they happen the way they do.
Yeah, and it's not necessary. You'll be provided the link to this to view this later as well. So you don't need to be in it. You're welcome to just follow along and we'll guide you through this. But this is, like we said, this is really a framework that we've used and it's gone through, I don't know, 5 or 6 different iterations now as we've tried to tune it down. And I think what we introduce sort of the W.E.B. Du Bois stuff as the start to sort of introduce the idea that data mapping can tell you about a population, much like we just did. But we do also do a covering of what open data is, which is probably not necessary for this audience.
Right. And so whether or not you're familiar with Miro, this collaborative platform allows you to, it's particularly useful for a visual experience for students where they are able to work with the hyperlinks that we've dropped in here and then launch and then go ahead and drop in their own interpretations, their own usage. And then in this workshop, we essentially share a guided discussion from the results. So for example, we go through part 1, very much like we've gone through it with you right now. And then we start to talk about evaluating the neighborhood through open data projects from the city agencies. So for this particular class, they were looking at Bronx District 5. I'm sorry, Bronx Community District 6. So we introduced them to the thematic profile of a community, the community profile provided by the Department of Housing. Then we take them through a slightly larger lens of the population fact finder. So we asked them to go ahead and locate Bronx 6 and look at the comparative data provided by topics such as age, crime, education. Then look and select a theme, whether it's health, transportation, environment, and housing. And then we go ahead and we ask them to select one map and graph from the tables and share them with the group.
And so in this case, to just pull it back to the slant example as well, the students start out with you can stay in the Miro board. Sorry. Sure. The students are given the task of analyzing the site that they will be doing their design project on. And one thing that we found really successful is instead of, say, giving them an address, like a specific place, which is really hard, and there's actually very limited data about one particular house, we instead have found that the community district scale is really the most helpful size to think about what's going on, and that it really represents the individual lives of individual people in that area in a really engaging way, where the students can understand, okay, this is, say, in this case, I think it's something like 20 blocks by 30 blocks or something, right? It's not a whole borough. it's not a census tract, right, which is somewhat arbitrarily drawn, but it's instead a population-based clustering
Mhm.
of a area in the 5 boroughs. And so students are able to understand, okay, if I build, for example, a community center or a library in this community district, these are probably the local people that will be using that site. What do I need to know about them? What might I be curious to know? And so the basic things are something like the most popular one that we always talk about is how far people commute to work,
Mhm.
right? Which is that many, as you get farther and farther away from, as you get into places in which the distance from the epicenter or distance from transportation networks get farther and farther, the time to work statistic, which is reported at the community district level, becomes incredibly high, right? And so if you live in Jamaica, where we looked earlier, your time to work could be really low. You could be in Midtown in 15 minutes, right? But if you live in Northern Corona, which has really no access to the greater transit network, your average time doubles for your commute in your community district, right? And so this is a really great way to analyze what could just be an aesthetic design decision around what or why something's there in a really engaging way.
Right, absolutely. So, so we give everyone about 5 to 10 minutes. They iterate this. Typically, they're working in groups of 2 or 3, and they start to produce maps and graphs. And then they exponentially learn about the neighborhood because then we ask everyone to share out over the mirror board and just talk about the results um, through this platform. So I'll just switch back over to the slide here so you can start to see some of the before. I'll go back to slideshow. So here's an example of very quickly in this 10-minute workshop where we're sharing and the students shared out their results. They composed this map by working with the layers, the New York City planning street map. They're talking quickly about flood insurance rate map overlaid on the tax district of the Bronx.
And so in this case, right, where you'll notice we're not showing you very beautifully rendered ArcGIS data sets on top of, right, 3D models or something. We're having the students interact in the open data portals, right? They're producing these data sets in the portal because that's really the level of engagement that not only our students but also your average person can have with open data. And we at first that made us really nervous, and we were really like, uh-oh, are we doing enough? Right. And the problem, I think, is yeah, we're totally doing enough, right? We're handing this data set to students in a way that they can engage with it. And most people in this case are students of open data, right? We're not experts. We're producing an interactive activity or an interactive workshop in which people can engage with the data. Would we love it if we had the opportunity to like fully download and integrate into Revit all of this data set? Sure, right? But that's something that's a little bit farther out at a wider community level, right? At like a human to human level, that's something that's going to happen in the future. In the present, we're really, really excited to be able to have students engage in this one Vanessa's got up here.
Right. So, students, they were very quickly able to say like, okay, well, this is what my population looks like. And they also realized they also started to realize, as you can see in this slide, where they were using a particular application, but they also realized that the data was coming from multiple sources, right? So it's coming from open data, but then it's also coming from beyond and from the American Community Survey. So we talked a little bit about that layering, demographics, and mapping tools and the agency's contributions, and just being critical of pulling all of that together.
Yeah. And we always like, it's a little bit complex, but we always like that it's very easy to make an assumption around what's going on in an area from a distance. But one of the nice things about design education in this format is that the students also go and visit the sites. And so there's not just a report out about the Hispanic percentage in community district 6 of the Bronx, right? There's also a on the ground engagement with it. And it's amazing to see by just engaging with it in this way and then engaging physically that some of the sort of oversimplifications of areas that we're all super familiar with sort of the general reputations of neighborhoods or something, those things fall apart really quickly, right? It's really easy to understand that there's multiple layers of data sets. There's also multiple layers of realities. DeFrantis asks, how do the boundaries for the communities come to be? Yeah, great. So that's what I was mentioning earlier. These are the community district boundaries that are set by the city. I can't speak too much as to the origins or editing of those, say, from their point of view. But we tried these same approaches with census tracts, with boroughs, and with I think you can even limit by like a pure map sense. And the community district was a really helpful way for us to use it.
And keep in mind that the community district is also a
Oh, yeah,
voice
correct.
of advisement.
Yeah, yeah. And so that's probably the answer, best answer we can provide in this context is that these are how New Yorkers vote for issues. It's the smallest scale of representation
Yes.
of intercity government power is via community district, right? So your block does not have any rights individually, but your community district can say, I think the famous example is in Astoria right now. The city said that there need to be more trees. They planted a bunch of trees in the middle of the sidewalk and no one could walk down the sidewalk. It's the community district that says, actually, we're perfectly happy, or we'd like to locate these trees in a different way. It's sort of a big government, small government, local government kind of thing.
So I want to
Yeah, we got to keep scooting.
share with you the second part of I'm sorry, really the third part of the activity, which is where we then ask the students, and now once they put their hands on it and they really can focus on the format and criticality, then we start to put the different data lenses in front of them. So the New York City Planning zoning map, Data to Go NYC, the larger NYC Maps Gallery, revisiting the community district portal, looking at the Department of Health community profiles, and then also the Data to Go Health. So asking them to consider their topical question prompts, and then considering questions about their specific neighborhood. We asked them to pan, filter, and select maps and filtered routes would provide information related to their questions.
Yeah.
And so then we asked them to go ahead and share a screen view. And you might say like, okay, well, what happened to not wanting just screenshots, but realizing that they're synthesizing the information that's illustrated in that screenshot as opposed to a arbitrary search.
Yeah.
We're giving them the whole workflow of where the information came from.
Yeah. And it is a simplified workflow, right? Like it is pointing, what you're looking at is the workflow, right? We're pointing at the data resources and asking for data queries of those resources, but that's much the same result as what's going on. I also think just worth mentioning that we're going to go through these questions here, and I think this is actually probably the hardest part of the workshop for us, and it was something that we struggled with a lot, which is how do you sort of shape someone's journey through a data system without requiring a right answer, right? Such that they're querying in an authentic and engaging way, right? Remember from our slant case study, we're really trying to get them excited about studying the area that they're assigned. We're not trying to tell them that it's exciting or show them that it's exciting in this case, right? Like it's a design research problem, not just a design problem, right? And so when we go through these questions, you'll see that they're not really pointed towards an answer. And I can imagine, I'm sure we've got a whole bunch of people coming from different industries and different worlds and workplaces. This can be really great. Like, how do you, and what are those questions that you ask your audience to respond to? They need to be less like what's wrong in our district, period. Like what's wrong in our district question mark, and more find 5 issues in our district that are different than the neighboring district. Right? You could query what's going on in yours and query what's going on in the one next to it really, really quickly and notice that, hey, no one ever complains about parking in our district, right? It might seem non-obvious, but when you can compare, and you can compare not just in a community district level, but you can also compare on a borough level. Those are the kinds of questions that if you worked at the transit authority, right, you would much rather be able to say, we're hearing that parking's an issue in our district. Can we study it across multiple scales? And I think that's really what we're doing in this third part that's different than the first part. We're not just having fun. We're now trying to sort of posit questions in that way.
Right. So, we prompted them with questions like, example of what are some health concerns in West Farms, share your maps and charts and then be prepared to discuss them. What are the general demographics of the area? Share them below. And again, like we pushed the students to really interact. I think it was like 7 to 10 minutes for this class.
Yeah.
And then just move you over here. So question 3, what are the existing climate and pollution characteristics? So students were able to drop them in and then have a discussion and share with the class like what was going on. So very quickly they were able to develop a discussion, a profile of the neighborhood and the gaps in services and the pressing problems, evidence for the pressing problems.
And I think if you zoom in on that bottom right one or top right one there, Vanessa, the houses with mold, I think this is a really great example of being able to discuss bias really, really easily, right? It sounds really scary that 12% of houses have mold, right? Or that sewer complaints are X percentage, right? And the classic one is what your district rates on the street cleanliness index, right? But it's really important to put things in context, right? Here, we're only 2% over the New York City average. And so that might actually not tell you that much about what's going on with mold in your district. You'd think, oh my God, 12%, right? But we know it's a huge city with a lot of stuff going on. And so this is one of our favorite how to engage with these problems is you see the sewer complaints graphed on the left. That's every community district gets a different bar. And then we can see where we are. We're almost at the bottom, right? And you'll notice it's a bell curve, right? But that tells us a lot about what's going on in a wider sense and enables our students and us and you and your colleagues and peers and students and whatnot to sort of actually engage and then disengage on different problems if you're trying to make an outsized impact of a certain kind, right? We don't teach landscape design, or I don't teach landscape design studios, and so I'm not necessarily engaged in something like decreasing sewer complaints, right? But that's something that you can imagine a student will be very quick to be like, I've got it, I'm going to save the world. I'm going to cause sewer complaints to go down to 0, right? And hint, there's no community district with 0 sewer complaints in New York City. That's an impossibility, right? And so scale matters a lot here. And one of the reasons why we love open data is it really puts that all out there.
Right. Absolutely. So let's jump over and look at some of the resulting projects that had come from this activity. So just to make sure you can all see my screen, right? So this is you're all seeing my slides. Right? Okay. So here's an example. Professor Evan Shees, he's a registered architect. He was the Design 5 professor for this class. And so the prompt was students were asked to find data pertaining to the 5 categories. And then produce multi-scalar maps. So translation being at the neighborhood level, at the borough level, and the city level. And then what is your hypothesis? In maybe a week's time. So here's an example of some of the students' output. They then produce these beautiful light boxes where they're visualizing the layers of data in a very tactile way. They're visualizing significant points within their neighborhood and really describing West Farms in a new way.
Yeah, and I think here, this is a form that I'm guessing the audience will not be super familiar with. But these models and graphics and whatnot in this case are used to tell a story about the site to, in this case, a set of judges and critics who come and critique the student's work. But the model is such that we're simulating a proposal to the city or a proposal to a developer or a proposal to a community district around why X, Y, or Z problem needs to be solved or engaged with in this way by this building, right? So this is a form here within the lens of design education that we're in, right? You can imagine this could be totally different if we were studying signage or typography, right? That this might be a graph of historical references that New York City might use over time, and we might use, say, historic photographs to map that out, right? This is a form of visual physical map making that architecture educators often use to have someone come and say, here's why our project should be here. Here we are mapping out XYZ factor, and here's how we summarize it. So that's we're going to go through a bunch of them. They're stunningly beautiful, but this is a form in which design education likes to work with, I think.
So here's another example where they actually took the data and repurposed it into a physical form to quickly emphasize the magnitude of some of the problems and the data sets.
Mhm.
So they have the sitemap underneath, and then each one of these is a layer of information. And the overhead, just to clarify, this map as an overhead view, you can see how these concerns go across the district, as opposed to the layers like this. You can view it from above. And so here's the third example of where the students chose to look at the prevalence of poverty, and how it was defined, and then they graphed it over the topographical map. And then they went ahead and shared, they took us through where the schools were, the parks and green spaces, and then dams. They were really looking closely at the Bronx River. And then their proposal based on the gaps that they could see in the three previous maps.
One of the things that we really like about working with open data in this way is it actually lets students get really ambitious, right? Because a student can propose a single intervention. I want to turn this park into a biology study land, right? Where we flood it X amount and watch what grows and put in a walking path, right? Some sort of interesting, engaging way to think about, say, the future of parks, right? And then by using open data, they can identify really, really quickly 30 other sites that could be used for this approach. And it lets you get to these large, ambitious city projects that are such an important part of the history of New York. It lets people engage with it at a much younger age without a huge team of resource, right? We're all being helped here by the open data team, but if you look historically, it would have taken an office of 40 people to identify potential, new potential developable micro park spots, right? It would have taken a team of 30 a year to figure that all out. Now we can hand that to a student nearly instantly, and they can make a proposal. We can critique it, we can challenge it, we can bring up all different sorts of questions of whether or not it's a good idea, but we actually absolutely love that the students get to engage in this really powerful way. Yeah.
So building your own classroom activity. Here we are. We've shown you a nice broad spectrum. And so these are the perspectives that we take as we're building out our own. Okay, well, we meet with a professor and we say, okay, well, what are some examples of the issues that you want your students, peers, or collaborators? This is the lens. So if you would like to share with the group in the chat, I think that's probably the simplest way here. If you just want to take some notes for your own interest moving forward, what are some examples of issues that your students, peers, or collaborators are thinking about that could be investigated through open data?
Yeah.
There's no right or wrong answer here. We're hoping in the 6 or so minutes that we have left that we can just encourage some additional, thinking outside the box.
Yeah, and we'll provide this this screen we'll build out, we'll talk through the questions, we'll give you a second to sort of jot down any ideas or something that you might have. But we'll show this all up on the screen, and you're welcome to take a screenshot and whatnot. And our goal here is that you could take this to whatever your potential user group is here and engage with the data in kind of in the way that we have, or in a way that best serves your people. So the first one, yeah, we ask, what are some issues that your students, peers, collaborators are thinking about that could be investigated just widely through open data? So I just mentioned public parks, infrastructure, streetscapes, health, behavior, legal issues, climate change, education, demographics, right? These are all different sorts of categories that open data literally has tabs that you can sort by in a whole different set of portals, right? Open data portals on top, and we show the portals because we don't have, our students are not data scientists, as many of your user groups, I imagine, are not. Yeah.
One that I often hear pop up when there's another project where the students think about Central Park.
Yep.
And a way to really get them to look at Central Park are the ecology, the lens of ecology. So things like the squirrel census,
Yeah.
the tree identification project, the event schedule for New York City parks. These are all things that help them like look closely at Central Park.
Yeah.
Obviously the historic maps, then and things like then and now are all part of that.
Yeah. Yeah, this one's the hard one, I think, and we have an answer, and then the professors whose students take our workshop maybe have a different answer. But what kind of visual outcomes could your students, peers, collaborators use to tell their story or engage with answering your first question? And so we looked at a bunch from Evan Chia's students today, but they can include links, right? In this case, to open data portals, which is really exciting. They can include redrawings, they can include physical models, they can include printed drawings, right? There's a whole slew of things that can be used as a visual outcome here, right? Like we're not a scientific review journal. We're not, a major stats journal trying to review everything there is to know about XYZ thing, right? We're trying to help people tell their story about open data, about the city around them using open data.
Right. And I think it's important to realize like a lot of these tools are interactive.
Yeah.
So for students to be able to manipulate and filter the data and produce a small animation
Yeah.
through a video clip of their use, or if it's the skill of exporting a spreadsheet, or producing a dashboard of multiple tables, like these are all things you can do with the different projects across the city agencies.
Yep.
And the last question that we want to consider is like, well, what are the biases and ethical considerations that you want your participants to engage with?
Yeah. Yeah, and this one's hard, but it lets people talk about data like they're data experts, which we really like, right? Like the time, location, like someone asked in the chat, well, how did you figure out the population density, right? Or the movement patterns of people throughout the site, right? Like there's a way in which students can investigate it. Even elementary school students could talk about that kind of stuff, but we might hold data we used for major decision making to a different standard. Singular data sources, agency perspective, missing data sets, all this sort of stuff is super important. And I think there's one more, Vanessa. Yeah. So we love learning outcomes in this case. And what could you, we ask you to write one learning outcome for an activity in which your students, peers, or collaborators engage with open data. So that could be anything from, we challenge our assumptions around blank, 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 right? Using the CRT model. But it also could be, we learn where the parks are around us, right? Like I am working in Columbus Circle right now, and we use open data to figure out where we can eat lunch when it's nice out, right? Just graphing open parks and open interior spaces when it's cold out. So.
Right, absolutely. And realizing, okay, well, going back, what was the original objective? Understanding more about gaps in healthcare, understanding more about major health concerns, quality of life issues, and then realizing, well, what is the essential time, population that you want to understand, and having the students be able to pinpoint and confidently say, I considered population over the last 5 years and versus 10 years.
Yeah.
Because oftentimes sometimes that can quickly be a mismatch. And when they're in these time constraints, it's important for them to be resilient, and be able to build on these data queries quickly.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we really appreciate everyone staying with us. through this presentation. I'm hoping that you can share any additional general questions in the chat. We are a little bit of a large group today, so I could just as well unmute yourselves and share a question with the group. We can also answer them afterwards as anyone needs. Oh, and let me share with you, so essentially the conclusion of what we talked about. What I want to share before we take up much more of your time is to consider, how you expand this with your collaborators. Elijah and I bridge this gap in and out of the classroom from the library. We've taught this class both in the library and the studio. Consider the nature of open data and the complexities of that, and considering the data-driven approaches, and then have fun exploring this amazing and expanding work.
Yeah. So yeah,
I also just want to, I'm sorry,
go
I
ahead.
just want to share this short link to the takeaway slide that I've included everything, and you can continue to add to this. The Miro board is there. Some of the data sets are there. There's lots of live links throughout. So
Yeah, if you needed anything back from what we went through today to help build out your activity. Yeah, I think that's it. So yeah, thank you guys very much for sticking with us, and we're really excited to